It was one of those nights when everything sparkled. The chandeliers, the crystal glasses, even the smiles that were painted on people's faces. The city's grand hotel had opened its ballroom for a charity gala, and every corner of it screamed elegance. The air smelled of roses and expensive perfume, the kind that lingered long after someone walked by. Laughter, soft music, and the clinking of glasses filled the space. At the center of it all stood a man who was the reason most of the guests had come. He was a famous pianist, known not only for his breathtaking performances but also for his attitude. He believed that true art was only for the gifted, and he made sure everyone knew he was one of them. Dressed in a perfectly tailored black suit, he greeted guests with a confident smile that carried a hint of pride. People admired him, feared him a little, and flattered him a lot. A large grand piano gleamed under the soft golden light. It wasn't just an instrument. It was a throne for him. Every time he played, he demanded silence and got it. The room would always fall still, as if even the air stopped moving to listen. Tonight would be no different, or so he thought. As the guests took their seats, he began his performance. His fingers danced across the keys like they were born to belong there. Each note was sharp, clean, and perfectly timed. He played with the confidence of a man who had nothing left to prove. The audience clapped after every piece, some out of genuine admiration, others because that's what you did when someone important performed. Near the back of the ballroom, among the floral decorations, a woman quietly worked. She wasn't one of the guests. She was part of the staff that had been hired to decorate and manage the event. Her dress was simple, her hair tied neatly back. She tried to stay out of the way, but her eyes couldn't help drifting toward the piano. During the break between sets, when the pianist stepped away to mingle with the donors and socialites, she slowly moved closer to the instrument. The room was still filled with chatter, the sound of champagne being poured and the hum of conversation. The woman gently touched one of the flowers near the stage, her eyes drawn to the glossy black piano like a magnet. She had loved music since she was little. Her mother used to play an old upright piano at home, one that was missing a few keys but still carried warmth in its sound. It was through those broken notes that she learned how music could tell stories, not perfect ones, but real ones. Without thinking, she hummed a familiar tune under her breath. It was soft, almost like a whisper, something tender and full of memories. The pianist, who was standing nearby speaking with a few guests, caught the sound. He turned his head, raising a brow. "Who's that?" one of the guests asked, noticing his expression. He smirked slightly. "Just someone trying to sing along, I suppose." But as he watched her, curiosity turned into amusement. The woman had moved even closer to the piano, almost unconsciously tracing the keys with her fingers. Not pressing them, just feeling them. He stepped forward, his shoes echoing lightly against the marble floor. "Do you play?" he asked, loud enough for nearby guests to hear. Startled, she turned around quickly. "Oh no, I was just—" He tilted his head, still smiling, but there was a sharpness behind his tone. "Just what?" "Admiring it. You looked like you wanted to play." A few people turned to look. The conversation around them quieted just enough for others to catch what was happening. The woman looked embarrassed, unsure what to say. "I used to play a little when I was younger," she said softly. I see," he said, his voice dripping with amusement. "Well, perhaps tonight's not the night for amateurs. This piano is a little demanding." A couple of guests chuckled quietly. The woman lowered her gaze, her hands fidgeting nervously. She didn't want to be part of any spectacle, but then one of the guests, slightly tipsy and eager for entertainment, called out, "Come on, let her play something." "It'll be fun!" Another voice joined in. "Yes, a little duel. Let's see if anyone can challenge the maestro." The pianist laughed lightly, clearly enjoying the attention. "A duel?" he repeated, pretending to think about it. "Why not? It could be amusing." He turned to her. "What do you say?" "Just one song." No pressure. The crowd encouraged it, clapping and laughing. The woman felt her heart pounding in her chest. She wanted to say no. She wanted to disappear. But something inside her, maybe the same thing that once loved music deeply, told her not to back away. I can try," she said quietly. That single sentence made the room erupt with excitement. Guests gathered around, whispering and smiling. Some curious, others clearly expecting to see her fail. The pianist gestured toward the piano with a gracious hand, like a king inviting someone to his throne. "Be my guest," he said. She slowly walked up to the piano. Her hands were trembling slightly as she sat down on the bench. The piano looked even bigger now, its polished surface reflecting her nervous face. The pianist leaned against the side of the stage, arms crossed, watching with a smirk. "Whenever you're ready," he said. She took a slow breath. Her fingers hovered above the keys but didn't move. Her mind went blank for a moment, and all she could hear was the faint hum of the crowd. Then, almost as if on instinct, she began to play a few soft notes, hesitant at first, like testing the waters. The melody was familiar, a gentle tune her mother used to play every night before bed. The pianist's smile faded slightly. It wasn't loud. It wasn't showy. But there was something in those few notes, a warmth that spread through the silence. People who had been whispering moments ago suddenly stopped. Even the waiters paused where they stood. The notes flowed like a quiet story told by someone who didn't need words. She stopped after a few measures, realizing everyone was staring. "I'm sorry," she said quickly, standing up. "I shouldn't..." But before she could step away, the pianist spoke. "Not bad," he said, still trying to sound casual. "But if you're going to play in front of people, you should at least finish the piece." A few guests laughed again, trying to ease the tension. He turned to the audience with a grin. "All right then, let's make it interesting. I'll play something and then she can try to follow it. Let's see if she can keep up." The guests clapped and cheered. The woman froze, realizing she had just been challenged in front of everyone. The pianist took his seat confidently, cracking his knuckles before placing his hands on the keys. He started playing one of his signature pieces, fast, dramatic, filled with complicated runs and flourishes. His fingers blurred as they moved, every note sharp and calculated. The audience, as always, was impressed. Some even whistled and applauded before he finished. When he struck the final chord, he stood up and bowed lightly. "Your turn," he said with a teasing smile. The woman sat back down, her heart racing. She could feel hundreds of eyes on her. Her palms were damp, and for a moment she thought about giving up. But then she remembered her mother's voice, calm and gentle. "Play like you're telling a story. Not to impress, to feel." She closed her eyes and pressed the first note. The sound was soft, fragile even. Then came the next and the next, each one flowing naturally into the other. The melody wasn't complex, but it was full of emotion. It felt like rain falling on old memories, like hope hidden inside sadness. The room went completely silent. For a moment, even the pianist forgot to breathe. The woman continued, her hands no longer shaking. She wasn't thinking about the people watching. She wasn't thinking about him. She was somewhere else entirely, back in the small room where her mother played the same song years ago, where the piano had missing keys but endless heart. When she stopped, there was a long pause. The silence felt heavier than any applause. And then one person clapped. Then another. Soon the whole room was filled with applause that felt genuine, not polite. The pianist forced a smile, but his eyes told another story. He hadn't expected that. Not from her. The woman stood, unsure what to do. She didn't bow, didn't say anything. She just smiled faintly and stepped back from the piano. People surrounded her, asking where she learned to play, if she was a musician. She shook her head and said quietly, "I just learned at home." Somewhere in the crowd, the pianist watched her. His confidence cracked just a little. For the first time in years, he wasn't sure of himself. Something about her playing, the simplicity, the honesty, had stirred something he thought he'd lost. And as the applause slowly faded, one thought echoed in his mind. He had challenged her to make fun of her. Now he wasn't sure who had truly won. The applause slowly faded, but the memory of her playing lingered in the air like perfume that refused to disappear. The grand piano sat silent again, its lid shining under the chandelier light, but it felt different now, as if the instrument itself had been touched by something pure. The guests slowly returned to their conversations, though they couldn't stop talking about what they had just witnessed. The woman, who had come to decorate flowers and stay invisible, had managed to steal everyone's attention with nothing but her heart and a few notes. She stood near the edge of the room, unsure what to do next. Part of her felt embarrassed, another part strangely free. People approached her with questions: where she had learned, whether she was a performer, if she had ever been on stage before. She smiled politely, shaking her head. "I'm not a performer," she said quietly. "I just used to play at home." The pianist, who had been standing a few feet away, didn't join the crowd around her. He stayed still, watching her from the side. His expression was hard to read, part disbelief, part curiosity, and a flicker of something he hadn't felt in a long time. Maybe humility. Later that night, after most of the guests had left and the music had faded into soft background chatter, she began gathering the leftover flowers and decorations. The staff moved quietly, cleaning up champagne glasses and folded napkins. The grand piano was closed again, almost like it too had gone to sleep. As she picked up a fallen rose petal, she felt a shadow behind her. She turned and saw him standing there. "You play beautifully," he said, his tone calm, stripped of the arrogance it carried earlier. She hesitated. "Thank you," she said softly. He looked at her for a moment as if trying to understand something. "You said you used to play at home?" "Yes," she replied. "When I was younger. My mother taught me." He nodded slowly, his gaze drifting to the piano. "Your touch." It was different. It wasn't perfect, but it had something rare. It felt honest. She smiled faintly, her eyes lowering. "I don't know about that. I just play what I feel." He wanted to ask more, but she seemed uncomfortable under the heavy light of the empty ballroom, so he simply said, "Good night," and walked away. But the sound of her melody stayed with him long after. That night, as she walked home, the city lights blurred through her tired eyes. Her hands still tingled from touching the piano keys. It had been years since she had played in front of anyone. Years since she'd even dared to dream about it. Her small apartment was quiet when she arrived. On the wall hung an old framed photograph of a woman sitting by a worn-out upright piano. Her mother. The picture was slightly faded, but every time she looked at it, she could still hear her mother's voice saying, "Music doesn't come from skill. It comes from truth." Her mother had been her first and only teacher. They couldn't afford lessons or fancy instruments, but they had love and patience. The old piano had chipped keys and squeaky pedals. But her mother said, "If you can make even one heart listen, you're already a musician." She had grown up playing simple songs, watching her mother's eyes close when she listened. But when her mother became ill, the music stopped. Bills piled up and days became longer. She had to leave school and start working. Anything to survive. The piano keys gathered dust, and eventually they sold it to pay for medicines. That was the day her world went quiet. For years she didn't touch another piano, not because she stopped loving it, but because it hurt too much to remember. Every key reminded her of her mother's hands guiding hers. Every note of a time that no longer existed. So when she played that night at the gala, something inside her had awakened, something she thought was lost forever. Meanwhile, the pianist couldn't sleep either. In his luxurious apartment, he sat at his own grand piano, the one custom-made in Europe, polished and flawless. He tried to play the same song she had played, but it didn't sound right. The notes were there, but the feeling wasn't. He had spent years perfecting his craft, mastering complex pieces, performing in front of kings and ambassadors, collecting trophies and awards. Yet for the first time he felt like a student again. He remembered her hands, slightly trembling at first, but steady when the music began. He remembered the look on her face, and not of pride, but of peace. There was no performance in it, only emotion. For years he had believed that perfection was everything, that mistakes were signs of weakness. But that night the woman had shown him something he couldn't ignore. That music wasn't about being perfect. It was about being real. He leaned forward, pressing one note softly, and whispered to himself, "How did she do it?" The next day, the woman returned to the hotel to collect her payment for the event. She kept her head low, not expecting anyone to remember her. But the moment she entered, several staff members smiled warmly at her. "That was incredible last night," one of them said. "You should have seen everyone's faces." She smiled politely, though part of her still didn't believe what had happened. As she waited near the reception, she heard a familiar voice behind her. "You came back." She turned and saw him again, the pianist, dressed more casually this time. He smiled faintly, though his usual confidence seemed replaced with something gentler. "I wanted to thank you," he said. "You reminded me why I started playing in the first place." She looked surprised. "I didn't mean to do anything. I just played." "Exactly," he said quietly. "You just played." There was a pause. Then he asked, "Would you have coffee with me?" She hesitated, unsure why he would want that. But his tone wasn't arrogant. It was sincere. "All right," she said. They sat in a small cafe near the hotel. He asked about her life, her music, her mother. She spoke softly, her words simple but full of meaning. He listened carefully, realizing how different her world was from his, and how much he had taken for granted. When she spoke about selling her old piano, her voice wavered slightly. "I thought I'd never touch one again," she said. "It was like losing a part of myself." He looked down, then said, "I think you found it again." She smiled, maybe just for a moment. He wanted to tell her how deeply her music had affected him, how her simple melody had struck something inside him that years of fame never did. But he couldn't find the right words. Instead, he said, "You should play again. Not for others, for yourself." She shook her head. "Life doesn't work like that. Music doesn't pay bills." He nodded. "I understand, but sometimes it gives us something money can't." They sat quietly for a while, sipping coffee, listening to the faint sound of street musicians outside. Days passed, but that night at the gala became the talk of the city. Someone had recorded her performance on their phone and posted it online. The video began to spread, not because of her beauty or her story, but because of the way she played. People described it as music that touches your soul. She didn't even know about it until a coworker showed her. Her hands trembled as she watched herself on the small screen, hearing the melody again. The comments were filled with admiration, strangers calling her the woman who reminded us what real music feels like. She didn't know what to say. Part of her wanted to hide, but another part felt a quiet pride. That same day, the pianist called the hotel asking for her contact. When he finally reached her, his voice was calm but excited. "You've gone viral," he said. "People want to know who you are." She laughed nervously. "I'm nobody." "Don't say that," he replied softly. "You're someone who made the world listen." That night, as she sat by her window watching the lights of the city, she thought about everything that had happened. The gala, the challenge, the song, the way people had looked at her. She realized that maybe it wasn't an accident. Maybe life had brought her back to the piano to remind her that she was still more than her struggles, more than her job, more than her fear, and somewhere across the city, the pianist sat at his piano too, playing her song, not perfectly, but honestly. For the first time in years, he wasn't trying to impress anyone. He was just feeling. Neither of them knew what would happen next. But one thing was certain, that night had changed them both. One found her lost dream, the other found his lost soul, and all it took was a few simple notes that spoke louder than pride, louder than fame, straight to the heart. The days after the gala felt strange for her. She went back to her normal routine, early mornings, work, and quiet evenings. But something inside her had shifted. It wasn't fame or excitement, it was something smaller, softer, like a spark that refused to go out. Every time she passed by a piano, whether it was in a shop window or a cafe, she felt her heart ache a little. She hadn't realized how much she had missed it, not the applause or attention, but the feeling of being close to something that once gave her purpose. At work, people still talked about her. Some had seen the viral video, others had just heard rumors. They looked at her differently now, with curiosity instead of indifference. But she didn't know how to react. For her, that night wasn't about being seen. It was about remembering who she used to be. One evening, she received a message from the pianist. It was short. "Would you come to the hall tomorrow? I'd like you to hear something." She hesitated for a long time before replying. Part of her wanted to stay away, afraid that the magic of that night might fade if she faced it again. But another part, the part that still dreamed, wanted to know why he had reached out. The next day, she arrived at the concert hall. The room was empty except for him, sitting at the piano. The same piano she had played that night. He looked different now. Not the proud performer from the gala, but someone quieter, more thoughtful. "I wasn't sure you'd come," he said with a small smile. "I almost didn't," she admitted. He nodded as if he understood. "I've been trying to play the piece you played that night," he said, gesturing toward the piano. "But no matter how many times I try, it doesn't sound the same." She tilted her head slightly. "It's just a simple song. You play far better than I do." He shook his head. "Technically, maybe. But that's the problem. I play perfectly, but I don't feel it." He pressed a few keys, letting the notes echo in the large, empty hall. "You played it like it meant something. Like every note was a part of your life." She smiled faintly. "It was." There was a long silence. Then he looked up. "Would you play it again?" "Just for me." She hesitated. Her hands trembled slightly. "I haven't played since that night," she said. "Then tonight will be your second time," he replied gently. She walked toward the piano slowly, her heart thumping louder with each step. When she sat down, the smooth surface of the keys felt like an old friend's hand. She took a deep breath, closed her eyes, and began to play. This time there was no audience, no laughter, no pressure, only the sound of her music filling the empty hall. The notes flowed naturally, like water finding its way through stones. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. He stood behind her, listening. The sound filled the space around them, reaching every corner. It was warm and human, something he hadn't heard in a long time. When she finished, the last note lingered in the air before fading into silence. He didn't speak right away. Then, softly, he said, "That's what music is supposed to feel like." She looked at him, her eyes calm. "You've been playing for years. You know that better than I do." He smiled faintly. "Maybe I forgot." Over the next few weeks, he invited her to the hall more often. At first she was shy, unsure why he wanted her there. But each time they played together, sometimes classical, sometimes simple melodies. He'd play something flawless and grand, and she'd follow with something quiet and full of heart. Together it became a strange balance, perfection meeting emotion. He began to ask her questions about how she learned, how she remembered notes, how she shaped the sound. Her answers were always simple. "I just listen." That answer stayed with him. Word spread that the famous pianist had been seen practicing with a woman no one recognized. People started wondering who she was, but he didn't tell anyone. He didn't want the world to ruin what felt pure. For her, those moments at the piano became a kind of healing. Every key she touched seemed to take away a bit of her past pain. The long nights, the silence, the years she thought music had left her. Sometimes she'd pause in the middle of playing and smile softly to herself, remembering her mother's hands guiding her when she was little. One evening, after a long session, he said quietly, "There's something I've been thinking about. I have a concert next month, a special one. I want you to play with me." She froze. "With you?" "Yes," he said, "a duet. Something simple, something honest." Her heart started racing. "I can't. I'm not ready for that. People come to see you, not me." He shook his head. "People come to hear music. They don't know it yet, but they need to hear yours." She looked down, her fingers fidgeting with the edge of her sleeve. "I'm just a decorator. I don't belong on a stage." He leaned forward slightly. "You belong where music lives, and that's here." The silence that followed was heavy but not uncomfortable. She could feel how much he meant it. Still, fear held her back. "I'll think about it," she whispered. The days turned into nights of quiet practice. When she went home, she replayed his words in her mind. "You belong where music lives." It was strange how a few words could open an old door she thought was locked forever. Sometimes, she'd sit by her window and hum softly, just as she used to when her mother was alive. It made her feel close to her again. When she finally agreed to perform, it wasn't out of confidence but courage. She wasn't sure she'd be good enough, but she knew she couldn't keep running from what she loved. The night of the concert came faster than she expected. The hall was packed, every seat taken, lights shining bright. The crowd murmured excitedly, unaware that the woman beside the famous pianist wasn't a professional musician but a florist who had once silenced a ballroom with a single song. Backstage, she sat quietly, her hands shaking slightly. The pianist approached her and placed a hand on her shoulder. "Don't think about them," he said softly. "Just play for yourself and for whoever you love." She nodded, swallowing hard. When they stepped onto the stage, the applause was thunderous. She felt dizzy for a moment, but the warmth of the piano bench grounded her. The pianist gave her a small nod, and together they began to play. The piece started with his part, precise and commanding. Then when her turn came, the hall transformed. Her playing was gentle but deep, weaving around his notes like sunlight through curtains. Together their sounds became one, not competing, not showing off, just blending beautifully. The audience fell silent, completely drawn in. Every note told a story as of pride, pain, loss, and rediscovery. Her fingers moved freely, her eyes half closed as if she were somewhere far away, somewhere peaceful. When the last chord faded, there was a moment of stillness. Then the applause came, not just polite clapping, but a roar that shook the hall. People stood cheering, some even wiping tears. She looked at the pianist, tears in her own eyes, unable to speak. He smiled and whispered, "You did it." She shook her head slightly. "We did it." Later, when the crowd had gone and the stage was quiet again, she sat alone at the piano, touching the keys softly. He joined her, standing beside the bench. "You changed something tonight," he said. "Not just for them. For me, too," she smiled gently. "Music changes everything when it's real." He nodded. "You reminded me of that." She looked at him and said quietly, "I didn't do anything special. I just played what I felt." "That's what makes it special," he replied. They sat there for a while, saying nothing, just listening to the faint hum of the empty hall. She realized then that music had never left her. It had been waiting, quietly, patiently, for her to come back. As she stood to leave, she touched the piano one last time and whispered, "Thank you." From that night on, she wasn't just a decorator who once played a song. She was someone who reminded people what true music sounded like. Not the sound of perfection, but the sound of the heart speaking honestly. And somewhere deep down, she knew her mother would have smiled that night, proud of the little girl who finally played again, not for an audience, not for fame, but simply because she loved it. The morning after the concert, the city felt different for both of them. The pianist woke up to a flood of messages and calls from friends, sponsors, and journalists. Everyone was talking about the performance, about the duet that had left the audience in tears. But what surprised him most was that the attention wasn't on him this time. It was on her, the quiet woman beside him who had played with such emotion that even he, the perfectionist, had forgotten about technique and felt something deeper. He scrolled through articles and comments, reading how people described the moment. The pianist played brilliantly, but it was the woman's touch that made the music alive. Another said, "Her hands told a story that words could never explain." He smiled, but it was a different kind of smile, one that carried both pride and humility. For the first time in his career, he was glad to share the spotlight. Still, he couldn't stop thinking about her. Not in a romantic way, but in the way someone thinks about a truth they've just discovered. Something that changes how they see the world. He had spent years chasing perfection, practicing long hours, performing for the wealthy, bowing to endless applause. But lately he had started to feel empty after every show. The cheers were loud, but his heart stayed quiet. Now he finally understood why. That woman, with her simple playing and honest heart, had reminded him of what he'd lost somewhere along the way. The feeling of why he started playing in the first place. She, too, woke up that morning with mixed emotions. The night had felt like a dream. The bright lights, the sound of applause, the feeling of the piano under her hands again. But now, as she sat by her small kitchen table with a cup of tea, she wondered what it all meant. The internet buzz didn't interest her. She wasn't chasing fame, and she didn't want to be treated like someone special. What mattered to her was that she had played, really played, for the first time in years. And she knew her mother would have been proud. But a small part of her heart felt scared. Would life expect her to become something she wasn't ready for? Could she ever return to the quiet, simple life she knew before that night? As she thought about it, her phone buzzed. It was him. "I'm at the cafe near the hall," the message read. "If you have time, join me." She smiled softly. She almost ignored it. Her instinct was to stay invisible again, but something told her to go. When she arrived, he was already there, sitting by the window with a cup of coffee. He looked tired but peaceful, like a man who'd been thinking too much and finally found something worth thinking about. "I wasn't sure you'd come," he said as she sat down. "I wasn't sure either," she replied, half smiling. They sat quietly for a while, watching people pass by outside. Then he spoke. "I wanted to thank you again. Last night, it was more than a performance. It reminded me of why I started playing." She looked at him curiously. "You didn't know?" He chuckled softly. "I thought I did. I used to believe music was about perfection, about control. I practiced until my fingers hurt chasing every flawless note. But when I heard you play, I realized I was missing the most important thing." "What's that?" she asked. "Feeling," he said simply. "You don't play for approval. You play because you have something inside you that needs to be heard." She lowered her eyes. "I just play what's in my heart," he nodded. "And that's what I forgot how to do." Over the next few weeks, they continued to meet. Not as teacher and student, not as performer and admirer, but as two people who shared the same language, music. Sometimes they played together at the empty hall late at night. Sometimes they just talked. He told her stories about his early years, about how he was pushed into music by strict teachers, how he learned to treat mistakes like failures instead of lessons. "I used to think every wrong note was a reason to quit," he said one night. "But now when I remember the way you played, soft, imperfect, but full of life, I realize those notes are what make music human." She listened quietly, her eyes soft. "When my mother taught me, she used to say that every mistake has a heart. You just have to listen close enough to hear it," he smiled. "Your mother sounds like a wise woman." "She was," she whispered, her voice catching slightly. She believed music could heal anything. He looked at her, realizing that maybe that's exactly what her playing had done. It had healed something in him. One day he invited her to his rehearsal. He was preparing for an upcoming world tour, big stages, cameras, and thousands of people. When she arrived, the hall was full of assistants and technicians adjusting lights and sound. She stood at the back, quietly watching as he played. His fingers moved fast, sharp, every note perfect. The audience would love it, but she could tell. Something was missing again. When he finished, the team applauded. He nodded politely, but his eyes searched for her. "What do you think?" he asked when he walked over. She hesitated. It was imperfect. He tilted his head slightly. "But," she smiled gently. "But it didn't sound like you." He frowned, confused. "What do you mean?" "It sounded like the man everyone expects you to be, but not like the one I've been playing with." Her words hit him harder than he expected. He turned toward the piano again, touching the keys softly. For the first time, he admitted to himself that she was right. He was performing again, not feeling. He took a deep breath and said quietly, "Would you play something?" "Here?" she asked, surprised. "Yes," he said. "Right now." Everyone in the hall turned to look. She hesitated, embarrassed, but he nodded reassuringly. Slowly, she walked to the piano and sat down. Her fingers moved gently, playing a simple melody. The hall went quiet. Technicians stopped adjusting cables. Even the lights seemed to dim, as if the world wanted to listen. When she finished, the silence stayed, peaceful and heavy. He turned to his team and said firmly, "That's what I want. That's the sound I need to bring back." From that day, his rehearsals changed. He stopped chasing flawless runs and began focusing on expression. Sometimes he'd close his eyes mid-piece, letting emotion guide him. People around him noticed the difference. His playing had warmth again, something they hadn't heard in years. And each time he stepped away from the piano, he silently thanked her. One night, after a long day of practice, they sat together near the stage. The lights were dim, and only the soft glow from the piano reflected on their faces. "I've played in hundreds of cities," he said, "but I've never felt like this before. It's strange. I thought I was teaching you something. Turns out you're the one teaching me." She smiled. "I didn't teach you. You just started listening again." He nodded slowly. "Maybe that's what I needed all along." There was a pause, the kind that felt natural, almost peaceful. Then he said quietly, "I want you to join me on my next concert. Not as a guest this time, Oak, as my partner." Her eyes widened. "Me? On your tour?" "Yes," he said. "I want people to hear what real music feels like, not just skill, but soul." She looked uncertain. "I don't think I belong in that world." "You do," he said firmly. "You belong wherever your music reaches hearts." She didn't answer right away, but deep down she knew what he meant. Maybe she had always belonged there. She just needed someone to remind her. In the following days, news began to spread. The famous pianist was taking an unknown woman on his tour. The media speculated endlessly. Some criticized him for it, others praised him for his bravery, but he didn't care. He knew why he was doing it. This wasn't about headlines. It was about truth. For her, it was terrifying but beautiful. She practiced quietly every night, not to prove herself, but to honor her mother's memory and the gift she had been given. She often whispered to herself before playing, "Just feel it. Don't fear it." As the first concert of the tour approached, she stood behind the stage curtain, her heart beating wildly. He turned to her, calm but serious. "Remember," he said softly, "don't play for them. Play for the one who taught you to love music." She nodded, tears forming in her eyes. "I will." When they stepped onto the stage, the crowd roared. But when the first note began, the world went silent. And as they played together, perfection and feeling intertwined, he realized that she hadn't just changed his music. She had changed his life, and she, sitting beside him, realized something too, that sometimes fate doesn't take away your dreams. It just waits for you to find the courage to play them again. His first concert of the tour became a moment the world couldn't stop talking about. People described it as magic, not because of the lighting or the grand stage, but because of what they felt deep inside when the music began. The hall was packed with people from every walk of life. Some came because they admired the famous pianist. Others came out of curiosity about the mysterious woman who had appeared in that viral video weeks ago. Cameras flashed as they walked onto the stage, but she didn't let the noise distract her. She kept her eyes on the piano, her hands calm and ready. When the music started, something incredible happened. The sound that came from the two of them wasn't a battle. It was a conversation. Every note she played seemed to speak, and every response he gave fit perfectly, like two hearts remembering the same story. The audience sat in silence, afraid to even breathe. By the time they finished, people were standing, clapping, and even wiping their eyes. After the show, videos of the performance spread like wildfire. Everywhere online, people were talking about her. They said her music felt like home, and felt like loss, felt like love. She had touched something inside everyone who listened, but for her, fame still didn't feel real. She returned to her small apartment the next day, carrying the same old bag and wearing the same quiet smile. The difference now was that her phone wouldn't stop ringing. Music schools wanted to invite her to speak. Orchestras wanted her to perform. And people she had never met sent her long letters describing how her music gave them hope again. Sometimes, she read those messages late at night, her eyes full of tears. It was strange. She had spent so many years thinking she was invisible. Now people were seeing her, not because she tried to be noticed, but because she had simply been herself. The pianist, on the other hand, was going through his own transformation. For the first time in years, he wasn't the star of the show, but surprisingly, that didn't bother him. Watching her receive the love and praise of the audience filled him with a sense of peace. He realized something that night. Greatness wasn't about being admired. It was about creating something that others could feel, something that could outlive the applause. After the concert, they sat backstage in silence. She was still catching her breath, and he was quietly staring at the piano. "You were amazing," he said softly. She shook her head. "We were amazing," he smiled. "No, you brought the music to life. I just followed," she laughed quietly. "You've spent your life being perfect. Why would you follow me?" He looked down, thinking, because perfection doesn't move people. "You do." The way he said it made her pause. For the first time, she realized that he wasn't saying it as a compliment. He was saying it as a truth. In the days that followed, invitations poured in from all over the world. Paris, Tokyo, New York. Everyone wanted to see them perform together. Reporters tried to dig into her past, wondering how someone like her could play like a master. Some called her a miracle. Others said it was luck, but she didn't care about labels. All she wanted was to keep playing. When they traveled together, she often looked out the plane window in disbelief. Just months ago, she was decorating tables and arranging flowers. Now she was playing in halls where some of the greatest musicians in history had performed. It was overwhelming, but she handled it with quiet grace. She never asked for fame, and she never demanded attention. During interviews, when journalists tried to make her a sensation, she always redirected the focus back to music. "It's not about me," she'd say gently. "It's about the sound that connects us. Music doesn't care where you come from." Her humility became one of the reasons people loved her even more. The world wasn't just amazed by her skill. They were moved by her heart. The pianist watched all of this unfold with deep admiration. Every time she stepped on stage, he could see the honesty in her eyes. There was no pride, no competition, only emotion. He found himself learning from her every single day, not through lessons, but through the way she carried herself. One night after a concert in Vienna, they went for a walk near the river. The city lights reflected on the water, and the air was cool and quiet. He said softly, "Do you realize what you've done?" She smiled. "Played another song?" He laughed. "You've done more than that. You've changed people's hearts, including mine." She looked at him curiously. "How?" He thought for a moment. "Before I met you, I played to impress. Now I play to feel, I think. I finally understand what my music was missing." She looked away toward the water. Maybe your music was just waiting for someone to remind you. He nodded slowly. Maybe it was. They stood there quietly for a long time. The sound of the water and the faint hum of the city filled the space between them. It wasn't awkward. It was peaceful, like the calm after a perfect note. As the months passed, their bond grew deeper. They weren't just duet partners anymore. They were friends. Two souls who understood each other without needing too many words. Sometimes they'd sit together without speaking for hours, just letting the piano do the talking. During one rehearsal, he stopped suddenly and looked at her. "You know," he said, "I used to think talent was everything, but now I see it's the heart behind it that really matters." She smiled gently. "That's what my mother used to say too." He hesitated. "I wish I could have met her." "She would have liked you," she said softly. "Once you stopped showing off." He laughed, a real laugh this time, the kind he hadn't let out in years. Their story began to inspire others in ways they didn't expect. Young musicians started writing letters saying things like, "You made me believe I can be myself and still create something beautiful." Schools began inviting her to talk about her journey, not as a celebrity, but as a reminder that greatness doesn't come from privilege. One particular moment stayed with her forever. At a small music academy, a little girl came up to her after a speech. The girl looked nervous but excited. "I'm not rich," the girl said shyly, "and my parents can't buy me a piano. But I play on an old keyboard that's missing 3 keys." She smiled warmly. "That's okay," she said. "You only need the keys that still work. The rest you can fill with your heart." The girl's eyes lit up and she hugged her tightly. That moment touched her more deeply than any standing ovation. Meanwhile, the pianist began changing his own approach to life. He started mentoring young musicians, not to teach them perfection, but to teach them emotion. He no longer walked into rooms expecting to be praised. He walked in ready to listen. He even began performing smaller charity concerts, often without charging a fee, saying, "Music belongs to everyone." At one of those events, he looked at her and said, "You know, I used to believe success meant applause, but now I know it means peace." She nodded. "And you finally have it," he smiled quietly. "Because of you." One evening, they received an invitation from a prestigious international music award show. The message said they were both nominated, not as competitors, but as a duo that had revived the soul of music. When the day arrived, the hall was filled with famous artists and reporters. Flashing cameras followed their every step, but neither of them seemed nervous. They simply held on to what they knew, that no matter what happened, their journey had already given them more than any trophy ever could. When their names were announced as winners, the applause was thunderous. But instead of giving a long speech, she took the microphone and said quietly, "Music doesn't belong to stages or trophies. It belongs to the moments that touch our hearts. Tonight, I just want to thank the person who reminded me of that." She turned toward him and the audience erupted in applause once again. He didn't speak. He simply bowed his head, humbled by her words. That night, when the celebration was over, they walked out of the hall together. The city lights glimmered, and for a moment everything felt still. He said, "You could have been anywhere in the world, doing anything. Why do you still choose this simple life?" She smiled. "Because simplicity is where truth lives. I don't want to lose that." He looked at her thoughtfully. "I hope I never forget it either." She stopped and turned toward him. "You won't. Because once you feel real music, you can't go back to pretending." He nodded slowly, realizing how much those words meant. As they walked away, neither of them knew what the future would hold. But one thing was certain. Their music had already left a mark on the world. It had changed lives, built bridges, and healed hearts. And somewhere inside both of them understood that this journey wasn't just about piano keys or melodies. It was about finding themselves through the sound that spoke louder than words. The sound of truth, humility, and human connection. Years passed since that unforgettable night when the quiet woman silenced a hall full of people with nothing but her piano. The world remembered that night not as a competition, but as the beginning of something beautiful, a reminder that true art doesn't come from fame or skill alone, but from honesty. She continued to play not for trophies or recognition, but for the same reason she always had, because music felt like breathing. Each performance carried a story, each note held a piece of her heart. People would say her music sounded like light breaking through clouds, warm, soft and alive. The pianist stayed by her side through it all. Together they performed in cities across the world, but no matter how large the stage grew, she never lost her quiet way of being. She still carried her small notebook with her, writing down ideas, melodies, and memories of her mother. Sometimes, before stepping onto the stage, she would whisper under her breath, "This one's for you, Mama." They were no longer just performers. They had become symbols of something greater. For many, they represented the idea that greatness could come from anywhere, and that real success wasn't about applause, but about connection. One evening, after years of touring, she suggested something unexpected. "I think I want to go home," she said gently. He looked at her, confused. "Home?" she nodded. "To the small town where I grew up. It's been years since I've been back." He smiled softly. "You want to rest?" "Not rest," she said. "I want to give back." She told him her idea. She wanted to build a small community center, a place where children could learn music for free. Somewhere kids could walk in barefoot, sit by an old piano and dream. He listened carefully, and by the time she finished, he didn't hesitate. "Then let's do it." Months later, the center opened in her hometown, a simple, beautiful building with big windows and warm light. She called it the Melody House. There were no expensive instruments or shiny decorations, just old pianos, second-hand violins, and children with bright eyes. Every afternoon, laughter and music filled the rooms. She would sit with the students, helping them press the keys gently, showing them that mistakes weren't failures, but little surprises that made music human. "Don't be afraid of wrong notes," she would say. "They make the right ones sound even more special." The pianist often visited too. He gave lessons, played with the kids, and sometimes just sat in the back listening. He said being there reminded him of what mattered most, the simplicity that fame could never give. Over time, the Melody House became famous on its own. Donations started pouring in from all over the world. People who had once seen her perform now wanted to support her dream, but she never let it grow too big. "I don't want this to become another academy," she said once. "It should stay small, a place that feels like home." She spent her mornings teaching, her evenings playing, and her nights writing music quietly by the window. She had no desire for more, but time, as it always does, moved forward. One winter, she fell ill. It started as something small, a cough, some tiredness, but soon she had to slow down. The pianist stayed close, helping her with the classes, making tea, keeping the center running. "You should rest," he told her gently. She smiled faintly. "How can I rest when the piano still needs playing?" He sighed but didn't argue. He knew she wasn't the kind of person who could stop doing what she loved. One quiet afternoon, as snow fell outside the window, she sat by the piano, her fingers tracing the keys without pressing them. He sat beside her and asked softly, "Do you ever think about that night? The one when we first played together?" She smiled. "Every day. It feels like a lifetime ago," he nodded. "You changed my life that night," she looked at him. "No, you changed your own life. You just needed to hear the truth first." They both laughed gently. Then she said something that stayed with him forever. "You know, music doesn't really end when the song stops. It keeps playing inside the people who heard it." He didn't say anything, and he just listened, realizing she was talking about more than music. Her health worsened over the next few months, and the day finally came when she couldn't play anymore. The children from the center visited her often, bringing flowers, drawings, and stories of the songs they were learning. She would smile and whisper, "Keep playing. Promise me you won't stop." And they always promised. One evening, as the sun set and painted the sky with gold and pink, she asked to be taken to the piano one last time. The pianist helped her sit down gently. Her hands trembled, but her eyes were bright. She pressed a few soft keys, slow, delicate, full of feeling. The sound was weak, but it carried everything she had ever been. When she finished, she whispered, "That's enough." He held her hand quietly, tears in his eyes. She smiled faintly and said, "Don't be sad. The music will keep going." That was her last performance. A simple melody, but one that would never be forgotten. In the days after, people around the world mourned. News outlets replayed clips of her performances, telling her story again. The woman who had once been mocked by an elitist pianist who had silenced a room with one song, and who went on to change countless lives. At the Melody House, the children placed flowers on the piano she loved. The pianist sat there for hours, running his fingers over the keys but unable to play. Then one of the children came up to him and said softly, "She told us to keep playing." He looked at the little boy, and something inside him broke, but in a good way. He nodded, wiped his tears, and began to play. At first the notes were shaky, but then, as he remembered everything she had taught him, the melody grew stronger. Soon all the children joined in, small hands pressing random notes, laughter mixing with tears. The sound filled the room. Imperfect, messy, beautiful. Just the way she would have wanted it. Years later, the world still spoke of her. There were books written about her life, documentaries filmed about her journey, but the pianist made sure none of them exaggerated who she was. She wasn't a legend, he would tell reporters. She was just real, and that's what made her special. He continued to perform, but his concerts felt different now. He didn't play for applause or critics anymore. He played to keep her memory alive. At every show, he told the audience a little story before the music began. Once I met a woman who reminded me that perfection isn't the goal, connection is. This song is for her, and then he'd play her favorite melody, the same one she had played the first time they met. The audience always went quiet. Some cried. Some smiled. Everyone felt something. One day, many years later, an old man walked into the Melody House. His hair was gray, his hands slower, but his eyes still carried warmth. He sat by the same piano where she had once taught. Children gathered around, whispering, "That's him, the one who played with her." He smiled and said softly, "She used to say music lives forever." "Do you believe that?" The children nodded eagerly. "Then let's prove her right," he said. And as he began to play, the room filled with that same feeling again. That gentle, honest sound that once changed the world. The children listened, eyes wide, hearts full. Outside, the wind moved softly through the trees, carrying the notes into the open air. Somewhere, it felt like she was listening too, because music, her music, had never really stopped. It was still alive in every heart that heard it, in every hand that touched a piano, in every moment someone dared to play with feeling instead of fear. The pianist looked up toward the sunlight streaming through the window and whispered, "You were right. The music never ends." And with that, he played her melody once more, simple, tender, eternal, until the last note faded, leaving only silence. But even in that silence, the world could still hear her.